So our theme today is related both to purpose and to perhaps a broader question as well about what's the point of business. And when I use the word business here, I'm using that in a very broad sense. So it's any organisation, whether for profit or not for profit, but an organisation that is coming together to create goods and services for use by other people. So that's, if I use that word, don't think about it only in a profit sense. Take a broad view on it. I think I know most people on the call, but maybe not everybody. My name's Lorraine Flower, and I'm part of Azure, which is a leadership and organisational development consultancy. But you'll see we describe ourselves as a conscious leadership and organisational development consultancy. What we mean by that is that we devote our focus to helping leaders and organisations to stretch their awareness, to stretch their thinking, to go beyond perhaps some of the more conventional aspects of business life and organisational life, and start to see their organisation, their practice as a leader within a bigger context, and within a context that is very connected to others and to the world as a whole. And we'll say a bit more about that as we go through. So I mentioned the webinar series, and I just wanted to remind people, some of you have been on those webinars already, of the 5 webinars that we've been running over these past couple of months. We'll do another series starting in September through till December. So we'll be publicising more information on that in due course. But these are the 5 topics that we've been discussing over these last couple of months and sharing our thoughts on. And what you'll see, hopefully, that links all of those together, is that actually in this current time, but even way before this, there was a need for leaders particularly to step into a new way of thinking and a new way of looking at their role as leaders. And this particular time that we're in, this massive pause, reset, global crisis, many names have been given to it, provide us the opportunity to step back, as well as obviously to run fast to deal with all the implications of it. But in the stepping back, we could perhaps think a little bit differently about the way that we configure our businesses and the relationship between our business and the rest of the world. And that's really where our focus is today. So we like to bring a quote or two in, because they can be quite useful in stimulating other thoughts and other ways of looking at the world. And Simon Sinek is one of our go-tos. There are others who are perhaps more philosophical or deeper thinkers, but he does have some good things to say around leadership. And I think this reminder about the core source of an organisation, of a company, or a group, is that it starts with someone or a small group of people who feel inspired, and they feel inspired not just to do something mundane, but to do something that feels a bit bigger than themselves. And that's really what we choose to tap into, and feel now more than ever that's what organisations are being called to do something that is bigger than they thought they possibly could do, and to get really connected with the core of what their organisation is about. What's the sort of sacred idea, if you will, the kind of core principle that sits underneath the reason for their organisation being in existence. And as leaders, we also need to stay connected with our inspiration and to the reason why we do things that we do. And the subject of why, in organisational terms, has been perhaps made more prominent by Simon Sinek's contributions. But today I want to bring that why into, again, a much broader space. And have us just think about, why do organisations exist? Why do we have them? What's the fundamental point of a business, of an organisation? Is it about making money? Well, that's in the for-profit sector. Is that the sole purpose of a business, to make money? Is it about making a few people rich? Is it about providing a service that's actually needed and that makes our world better, makes life easier, improves the quality of life? Is it about satisfying a want? As someone who used to be in marketing and has spent over 40 years in business in one form or another, there's a lot of effort that goes into psychology and telling us about the things that we have to have in our lives in order to live a fulfilling existence. Is that really what business is about? Is it about creating unnecessary wants or creating bars for us that actually have nothing to do with the quality of our lives? Perhaps business is about creating meaning and purpose. Perhaps actually the reason we come together in groups is because we're tribal and we like to associate with others and to see some value in that association. But perhaps also it's because it's a place where we can showcase our talents and develop those gifts and talents that we were born with. So what is a business or an organization, and why does it exist? And the question that also underpins that then is, if we start to ask those questions and if we start to get to some sort of understanding of that, we then also start to come to a deeper understanding of what our purpose actually is. And when we connect with our purpose, it becomes a lot easier and a lot more powerful for others to come alongside, whether that's in a partnership basis, as a client, as a customer in some way, as an employee, as a member of that team. When that belief, that passion, that inspiration, that truth of why we've come together as an organization is expressed clearly, then we start to become far more attractive and indeed more successful, because it gives us our North Star, our sort of compass point against which to come back and measure all the things that we believe need to be done. In terms of where we're at as an organisation, as Azure, we have a very deep held, passionate belief, and that is that conscious leaders, so those who are thinking more broadly, thinking more deeply about their role as leaders and the role that their organisations play, and indeed great organisations, so those that really are paying attention to all of those questions, that the combination of those two things will change our world for good, will come to a place where actually business and organisations are one of the primary catalysts. They already are. The question is, are they operating from a conscious place of change and changing our world, or are they still looking at that sort of fundamental, more selfish need, which might be about making money, or it might be about satisfying their own interests and need for perhaps power, authority, and all sorts of other things that can come in there. What we do know is that our people want to create a better world. That's becoming increasingly evident. A lot of the dialogue that's going on at the moment around and within the crisis is about how we create a better world. We know that global consumers right across the world want to see alignment between a purpose and a better world. And we see that ethical investment is also growing, where in fact nearly half of ethical investors factor in environmental sustainability and governance considerations in their decision making about who to work with and who to invest in. So the world of business, the world in which business is operating, is changing. And in fact, if we go right back to the sort of core of business's role, we can see, this is from a trust survey undertaken by Edelman every year, and it's quite a broad-ranging barometer on trust, and this is from their 2018 survey. And what is very clear from this survey, and it comes back to our core belief, is that business is expected to lead. Business is not expected to wait for governments to solve the problem. And of the people surveyed, 64% say that they expect CEOs to take the lead on change. So that puts a very clear spotlight on organisations and businesses to play their role in creating the world in which we all would like to live, want to live going forward, and indeed the world we want to leave for our children and the generations behind them. And so for CEOs, it is about building trust. It is about building trust in what they do, how they do it, how they stick to the commitments that they make, moving beyond rhetoric and beyond nice narrative and into something that is sustained through everything that they do, everything that they believe in. And that is what's being required of business in these current times. And we can see some changes in those areas, and we can take encouragement from the changes that are happening. The US Business Roundtable is an organization of nearly 200 top corporations in the US. And tracking their statements about the purpose of business is quite interesting. In the US, there is legislation that is very clear that the purpose of a business, a for-profit business, is to return profits to shareholders. It's very clear that's what it's about. It's very singular in its expression. This roundtable, which is a very influential business roundtable, has charted an interesting journey in its expression of what the role of business actually is. You can see in the 1980s, they were making statements that had a certain amount of emphasis on social conscience. So yes, of course, the shareholder must receive a good return, but legitimate concerns of other constituencies must also have the appropriate attention. Notice the language, the appropriate attention. Interestingly, in 1999, so not quite 20 years later, they'd shifted to a very singular expression of the purpose of business, which is to generate economic returns to its owners. The principal objective of a business, very much mirroring the legislation that existed in the States from decades and decades ago. By 2019, in fact, their most recent statement has changed that language again. And now what they're saying is each of our stakeholders is essential. So we've gone from an appropriate attention to essential and a commitment to deliver value to all of them. Now, between 1999 and 2019, again, another 20-year-ish period, we saw, of course, the financial crash. And at the time, of course, we saw some changes coming from that, but probably not as many sustainable changes as we all would have liked. But this statement potentially provides some encouragement. There are other signs of encouragement too. So Alex is asking or making a statement, it would be interesting to ask some big businesses now how close they are to their original goal. And many may well find themselves unrecognizable. I think that's a really key point. And I wonder how many organizations actually ever go back and really think about what did we set out to achieve? Even those that are multinational global organizations, what did we set out to achieve? And how close to that are we in bringing that to life? And even if we've changed it, how well have we tracked that change? So there is some glimmer that those in power in organizations are starting to think more broadly about what the purpose of business really is and why businesses exist. This is an extract from a number of quotes, and there are many quotes, as you can imagine, given by all sorts of chief executives on what the purpose of their business is, what the purpose of business in general is. And these are some of the more uplifting, and there are actually quite a few out there that are quite uplifting. And I think some of the key things we can see here is that there are a growing number of CEOs who are certainly talking the talk. So they are expressing something that speaks to a much bigger corporate mission than just profit, taking Salesforce quote there. Or Paul Polman, who no longer heads up Unilever, but who very clearly has been a strong advocate for a much bigger focus on greater good in the way that business, and specifically Unilever, structures itself and the way it approaches its role in the world. So we can take some hope, we can take some encouragement from the words, but as we all know, words are cheap, or at least they can be, and they can sound good. Actually affecting that into the organisation is a much bigger challenge. And so really delivering that talk in meaningful ways is one of the biggest challenges, I think, facing CEOs at this time, in terms of what is the point of business. And what we do know and what we see is that there is something that we could call a purpose gap. And I think most of us in organisations would recognise that there is a lot potentially said, maybe increasingly more is being said around the purpose of an organisation. Sometimes it can be quite superficial, perhaps not necessarily very deep or well thought through. And that's where this gap point comes in. This survey undertaken by McKinsey back in October 2019, so I imagine if they were to rerun it now, some of these numbers might even strengthen in some respects or weaken in other respects. They surveyed around 1,200 managers and frontline staff, and the respondents, as you can see, reinforce what we on this call all know without doubt, and that is that purpose is important, and that the content and quality of that purpose is also important. 72% purpose should receive more weight than profit. Now, none of this is about knocking profit or the need for good financial governance. All of those things are critical. We know from our own budgeting at home, if we don't have the right balance of finances, then life comes to a bit of a grind, grinding halt. So we do have to do something about that. But it's about the level of balance we have within our attention to profit versus other things. But what is also clear in here is that 42% of those people surveyed say that organisations' purpose statements are failing to, only 42% are agreeing that those purpose statements have an impact in the organisation. So that's 58% are saying that, in fact, yes, there's a statement out there, but it's not actually delivering any good. It's not actually making things any better. And there are two other aspects to the purpose gap, and that we're starting to see come more and more onto the radar. One is the way in which the public, clients, the public in general, perceive the business and its potential for doing good. And that's certainly an increasing gap. And we're seeing more boycotting of companies coming through, more demand for a focus on multi-stakeholder attention. But the other gap that is there is that increasingly employees are expressing their desire for meaning at work, and there is a gap between what they want to feel and what they actually experience. Just picking up on a couple of the other comments here. News about widespread redundancy is quite dispiriting. Some organisations being too short-term in their outlook. I wonder what the CEOs would think if they stepped back and looked at their purpose. And recognition that decisions are really tough. Thanks to Rich for that. Absolutely, the short-term versus long-term question is fundamental. And also here we hit into the core of money in its and the way we all relate to money. Those of you who've been on other webinars, I can try to think when I last made reference to this, but there's a great example of a chief executive who recognised that some of his employees were unable to move on with their lives because they didn't earn enough money to start a family or to buy a house. And he was earning millions as the owner director of this organisation, and set about establishing a baseline salary of $70,070 US dollars for all members of the organisation. So redistributed the wealth in the organisation to give more advantage to those who were further down the salary ladder, and did the same for himself. And whilst they had a rocky few years in terms of embedding that, because not everybody sees that as positive news, strangely enough, including some of the other key senior people in the organisation. Ultimately, they have come through that, still with that policy in place, and with people having moved on with their lives in very powerful ways, and the business having successfully stabilised and grown. So longer term decisions can be taken by adjusting some of those things we take for granted. I mentioned Unilever earlier, and Alan Jope is the new CEO, well, new, not so new now, but is the CEO, current CEO of Unilever. And he, again, makes some key points about Unilever as an organisation, which I think we could argue is one of those organisations that is looking to the longer term and is trying to push back on some of the short-term profit-driven thinking that we see going on in many businesses even still today. And they speak of three deeply held beliefs. So, we're really getting into the emotion of this. Brands with purpose grow, companies with purpose last, and people with purpose thrive. Now, if we can bottle that and turn that into something real in the way that we construct our businesses, both short and long term, then we start to build something that is much more of an organism and less of an accounting structure in that sense. He goes on to say they've been operating a multi-stakeholder model for about 10 years, brought in place by Paul Polman, the original CEO original CEO I mentioned earlier. Paul Polman is also famous for having pushed back to the investors, who, as you will be familiar, those of you who are in for-profit businesses and publicly quoted businesses, they demand up-to-date information every quarter. How's the business doing? What are the profit forecasts? How's it all looking? And pull a lot of strings in that respect. And Paul Polman pushed back against that and made it clear that he was focusing on longer-term strategy, as you brought in, Rich, and that they could, in a sense, go jump as far as the short-term quarterly profit statements were concerned, because he was charged with taking the business forward and was going to make those decisions that enabled those short-term balances to be offset against longer-term thriving. And as you see from what Alan Jope is saying here, they see that longer-term picture as being about concern for employees, customers, society, and the planet, as well as suppliers and partners. Then all of that, when it's taken care of, will ultimately benefit shareholders who will be well rewarded. Well rewarded is a qualitative statement. Doesn't mean to say that they become the only focus, and therefore it's not about maximizing, it's about optimizing. So let's just take a moment, and I just wanted to give you a chance to share, either again in the chat. I know some of you may not be able to speak on the microphone. It's a technical issue for one of our participants today, but maybe through the chat. To what extent is your organisation clear about its business, and how lived is that? Does that really come through in the way that you approach and see your business approach day in, day out? So does it go beyond being a nice statement? And have you come across any other examples of truly purpose-led organisations? A couple of comments here around short-termism, and of course that, how do we live and have the courage to live in the kind of longer term? Well, some of that I think is helped by the fact that the broader narrative is shifting slowly, but it is shifting, and we are seeing some opportunity to build on the back of that, as organisations like the World Economic Forum, United Nations, many of the big movers and shakers, the US Business Roundtable. There are many organisations who are starting to shift the conversation, as well as many individual CEOs who are doing so. And I'm going to share a few more examples of that shortly. But we've got to also educate shareholders in this process, not just in the obvious sense, but in the collaboration in that longer term perspective, so that we can use the strength of leadership and the courage of leadership to overturn some long-established practices, in fact, that focus on the money side of business as opposed to the community and multiple stakeholders and quality aspect of business. I don't mean in terms of quality product, quality experience. So let's then press on. Alex, very happy in favour of the 70,000 per employee. And yes, of course, we'd all love that. But it is possible, and Dan Price certainly proved that. So let's move on then and just kind of expand this out a little bit further to look at what is actually going on out there that might affect the way in which some of our organisations are functioning and the way in which they think about their role, their fundamental role and their purpose. We can see, in an obvious sense, a rise of fear through this current crisis, and the scale and nature of that crisis, and the fact that it clearly isn't going away. But it's not new, that fear. That fear has been around in a lot of different ways. And what we're starting to see now is that is becoming more universally evident and starting now to affect some of the actions that people are prepared to take. So we've had fear in all sorts of ways, whether it's been fear of terrorism, fear of the impacts on the environment and the loss of life and loss of property, which we've seen a lot of in the last couple of years. We're also starting to see, it's been around for a while now, this assault on truth and a lot of fake news and who do we trust. And here is an opportunity for organisations to really step in and become fundamentally trustworthy and to demonstrate that time in and time out in the way that they go forward. We're seeing a growth in activism, both on a local level and on a global level, and starting to happen on a more financial level. People are not sitting back anymore. So our society is starting to get involved in the sort of changes that it wants to see, and businesses have to pay attention to that. They have to start to recognise that people do have power, they do have a voice. Yes, they can vote with their feet, but also they can bring about much bigger changes, and I'm going to give a couple of examples of that in a short while. We're also starting to see a greater recognition of the fact that our ecosystem, that the planet on which we're living, is barely able to sustain us anymore, and we're doing insufficient to change that, and that's demanding more action and more attention from organisations. As I said right at the beginning, organisations, businesses have the power to change our world because we are everywhere. Whether you're a local small business or a global business, you are integrated within the whole system of life and therefore can have an impact on it. We're seeing a growth in consciousness. I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a moment. And by that, I mean a sense of connection with a better world for all and maybe a greater good, and a sense that is real, not just a kind of an idealized concept, but something that actually affects the way we live our lives today. And we're starting to see a growth in a redefinition of capitalism, triple bottom line, conscious capitalism. These are phrases that have been around for a few decades, but are starting now to bite, particularly as banks and investment organizations start to recognize the power of a more ethical investment agenda, although that's not the only catalyst for it. And there are other things that I'm sure you could name as well. What is increasingly clear, though, is that we are starting to, I believe, recognize and appreciate the power of interconnectedness, or the reality of interconnectedness, I should say, that we are all connected, that what happens in one community or for one individual actually does have an impact in other areas. And the COVID-19 has brought that to life in a very clear and clearly devastating way for many. And so recognizing that that we are connected with each other. We're connected on a human level, we're connected on a multi-kingdom level, animals, plants, mineral, the whole system is connected. That brings about a new responsibility, a new level of awareness that we need to be able to tap into when we're thinking about the purpose of business, and what a business and an organization is even all about. And probably goes so far as to say it's time for a radical rethink, and to create a new and real partnership between organizations, between businesses, and between our planet, people, and all living beings. We would certainly argue that that is true, and the time is now. But I think there's also evidence of that coming through in other ways. And I'd just like to share, I'd mentioned PepsiCo, I've given a quote from PepsiCo from Indira Nooyi, who was the former CEO of PepsiCo. And I just want to share an interview. She was part of a panel at the World Economic Forum a couple of years ago. And I think this is quite a powerful piece.
Mark. But I think it's a great question. It's a bit inflammatory, but it's a great question. I think what you're getting to is, what is the soul of the company? What does the company really believe its business model is? Is it an ethical business model for the societies? Okay? When you sold products 50 years ago, that was fine for a society that was active. As society became more sedentary and all kinds of other lifestyle issues cropped up, should you change the portfolio? Yes, absolutely, and companies are doing it. But you've got to feel it inside you that you want to change the portfolio as a way to make money, that you've got to do things right in terms of water usage, carbon footprint, in order to make money. Typically what's happened is companies focus on making money during the day, and they give money to a social cause in the evening, and they say, this is corporate social responsibility. To me, that is confession, going to confession. I think what we ought to think about is, how do we make money differently? How do you change the fundamental business model? So unless you make money the right way, transforming your portfolio, being environmentally sustainable, treating your people right, unless you do that, you can't drive performance. That's what we've been trying to do. And as I said, scars on my back based on the first 6 years of my CEOship. Kudos for the last 6 years of my CEOship. And so it takes a while. If you've got a strong board, if you're willing to go out there and take what it takes to, and do what it takes to get your message across, there is hope. Will your competitors challenge you at every point in time? In my industry, they do. Where I said, lower the sugar levels, go to a different product portfolio, they double down on sugar drinks. So what do? You lose share, you give up some share. That's okay, because we played a different portfolio game. But educating the investors was difficult. It requires enormous courage, conviction, consistency. Painful, very painful.
So a number of key points that Indira brings out there that I think are useful for us to think about. Of course, needing to feel it, needing to believe in the business that you're creating and the change that you want to make. It can't just be a heads-driven process, because that leads you straight back to a profit-based decision, a money-making decision. She speaks about money and the need to make money, of course, and particularly for-profit businesses want to bring a return on the investment. But even there, I think there's opportunity for further change to be considered, which is around not seeing money as an end in itself, but as a means of actually helping to fund greater projects and improve the quality of life for all, and to be more philanthropic in the way that we think about money, particularly as shareholders, where we don't know whether people on this call are shareholders, but to see that the use of money is a resource. It's not simply there to be accumulated, because it's useless in that context. Having money in our bank is actually useless. It's just dead energy. We have to do something with it and create a new way forward. But she also speaks about the courage that is needed to take that long-term view. And her 6 years, as where she was given something of a beating for her strategies, and then 6 years where, when those strategies worked, she was hailed as an all-conquering hero. This is about consciousness. This is about how we start to see our relationship with the world in which we live, and the degree to which our attention is entirely focused on our needs, or as an organisation, selfishly focused on what we're about, and the degree to which we start to bring in this multi-stakeholder perspective. And shifting our consciousness is key to shifting the way in which business performs its role in the world going forward, and the way in which it then starts to see the world as an intrinsic part of its own heartbeat as an organisation. Again, whether you're in one part of it or in a global constituency, starting to see that your business, your organisation, is actually fundamentally responsible for this collective entity, and needs to play its part in the world accordingly. How do we do that? Well, there are, too many different things to mention on this call, all of them, but I've picked out a few that I think are useful. How do we do it? Well, we do it by adopting some new principles. And this one here, which is the blueprint for better business, speaks of 5 core principles, all of which we've really touched upon. But purpose which delivers long-term sustainable performance, being a good citizen, honest and fair with customers and suppliers, responsible and responsive employer, and a guardian for future generations. So it's about taking all of those elements and bringing them together into a whole, and balancing those is not easy. I'm not trying to suggest for 1 second it's easy, but it is the challenge of leadership going forward. It's what we need to do, and we need more people like Indira Noy to help us do that. And we have more people like her coming around. And I wanted, therefore, to also share with you, some of you may be familiar with the principle of B Corps. And I mentioned very early on in this session that in the USA particularly, the legal definition of a business responsibility of a business is to create shareholder return. That's its sole purpose. And to get around that, the incorporation of a new form of business called B corporations was set up. And this is the declaration that underpins B Corps. That they become a business, that the business is seen as a force for good, that it's purpose-driven and creates benefits for all shareholders, that B corporations are the change that we seek to see in the world, that they focus on people and place, and that they aspire to do no harm and benefit all, and that they can see the interdependency of each other and the impact on future generations. And these factors will start to help business think differently about the way they are structured. And there are growing numbers of B corporations, currently over 3,000 companies across 150 industries, all brought together by this unifying goal of being a business as a force for good. Anthony's reminding us that the transition from potential mass unemployment, depressed consumer confidence, and moving to a purposeful green economy will define our society. Yes, and business can play a key part in helping that, both in the way it works within the organisation and the way that then gets expressed outside. And a positive example of that is Danone. Danone is currently has established as its vision the desire to, its global ambition is to be one of the first multinational food companies to obtain global full company B Corp certification. And but having said that, it has been operating in this way since its inception in 1972. It's across 130 markets, so it's a complex business, and it has had a long-term purpose-driven agenda. It's committed to balancing what it calls a dual project, economic success and social progress. It holds both of those in every decision that it takes. It set up the Danone Way in 2001, which was focused on sustainability, and its vision is about the health of people and planet being interconnected, one planet, one health. So there are examples of large organizations who, at the core of them, of their being, see themselves as more than about money, but as about the contribution they bring to the world. I mentioned earlier also the role of employees in this change process. And whilst leaders and CEOs and shareholders all play a big part, so do employees. And as employees, we will all have had times when we have felt that perhaps our voice wasn't heard, that we were caught up in the system, having to comply with the system. We may have felt relatively powerless in some respects, even at perhaps at quite senior levels. And yet that's changing. That is changing. And the agency, in other words, what is it that an employee can do? What's the impact and the power that an employee has, is starting to shift, especially amongst those who have specialist skills. What we're seeing happen, and some examples of this particularly come out of Silicon Valley in recent times, is that groups of employees are starting to push back against some of the decisions being taken by the employers. Google had successfully put in place a contract with the Pentagon, a project called Project Maven. And some Google employees managed to get that project challenged and cancelled because they didn't like the idea that artificial intelligence was being used, i.e. that they were creating, was being used to better interpret drone footage. And they were arguing that they believed that Google should not be in the business of war, and successfully upheld that challenge. This seemingly empowered Microsoft employees. Whether there was cause and effect isn't known, but it would seem there may have been one, because months later, a group of Microsoft employees protested at the contract that was put in place with US immigration between Microsoft and what's called ICE, the immigration department in the US, because of the immigration's role in the separation of children in the US-Mexico border dispute. We've got Malcolm, thank you, is also has offered us Adidas as a good example of employee activism. I don't know the details of that, so if there's any more you can add to that, Malcolm, that would be great. We're also seeing companies like Amazon and Salesforce joining in, the employees from those joining in to pull out of the contracts with the US immigration. The key here is not just about, should employees stop something, a decision that's been taken at higher levels or elsewhere in the organizations. Of course, that voice needs to be heard, but it's also incumbent on the CEOs or the senior people in the organization to create more transparency around decisions, to be much clearer about what they're doing and why they're doing it, and what considerations have gone into those decisions. And that is not happening sufficiently in many cases. So that open line of transparency is being demanded more and more amongst employees. And many of you may be either fed up with hearing about millennials and Gen Z, but the fact is that there is a definite shift as a result of these younger people in the workplace. And we all, I'm sure, when we enter the workplace, like to believe we're part of a new generation that's bringing new thinking, and for sure we are. I think this is of a slightly different order. And this schematic here is from the 2019 Deloitte Global Millennial Survey. And a few things that I just wanted to pick out that again reinforces some of the things that I've been offering into this session. Firstly, the need to align purpose and profit. That's what they're seeking, that's what they say they want, that's how they've responded in this survey and what we see spoken about. A commitment to lifelong learning is something also that they bring forward in this survey. A commitment to growth and development, they say, are key to their loyalty. A true expression of shared values where there is alignment between what they believe in and what the organisation says it believes in and acts on. And a commitment to environmental and planetary issues, and to see that connection in the world, as well as a whole bunch of obviously private, personal ambitions that they have as well. So we are seeing push coming from a number of other sources. Excuse me, I'm going to mute for a second because I just need to cough. And as leaders in organisations, we have a responsibility to address ourselves to all of the voices and find new ways of responding to them. Another voice that I believe we need to pay attention to is one where we redefine the word growth and the meaning of growth. Interestingly, in the current economic climate, the discussion around GDP is increasingly becoming irrelevant as we start to understand the scale of the economic impact of this pandemic. And we need to be able to redefine growth as not simply about ever expanding markets, ever expanding economies, but as something that is a much more positive circular system. And I said in our last webinar that I'm going to offer in the autumn something on new economy, and I think this is core to redefining growth. We have to define it in a much more closed loop sense, where money is reinvested for the betterment of our planet and of our people, and not simply as a means of building stockpiles for authority, power and influence. So we have to redefine growth. We have to redefine it politically, economically, and personally, and see that actually in organizational terms, growth is about our people, and it's about the way in which we expand our capabilities to impact the world. So before we close, I wanted to open up again for some reflection. I've put a bunch of ideas down, and I've got one more slide to contribute that talks about how we might do this, or sums up some of the things about how we might do this. But I wanted to again open up any other sharing. Anybody want to say anything I've missed in the chat that you wanted to come back and pick up on? Rich saying, felt my mind shift significantly about purpose, and it started with the 2008 crash and has developed, especially in the last 4 years since the Brexit discussion. I'd love to see happiness of society being a new definition of success, and we see that coming through actually in some country level. It hasn't quite yet taken hold in organisational terms, but I agree a happiness measure, or refined happiness measure, needs to come to the fore much more. And I know we've got employee satisfaction surveys, but they really don't get to the nub of this issue in our view. From Alex, our current leader has been very visible and accessible during the pandemic, holding weekly conference calls and regional forums. Last week he started a call by challenging some recent negative behaviours on the sessions, and he was applauded for this show of strength. And this is key. We have to walk the talk, as he said, and really bring that to the fore. So any other contributions before I press on into our last few minutes? So can we redefine the point of business? Well, we believe we can. You've probably gathered that from what I've shared so far. And we have to move from just the why of business also to the how. So once we've clarified more fully our purpose, we've then got to work out how we actually make that a living thing. Firstly, we've got to recognize that purpose is emotional. Indira Nooy, I think, brought that to life very well by that sense of passion and belief that she spoke about. It is about empathy. It is about connecting with our world, with our people. It is about connecting with the idea of meaning. It's also important to take vital to take a multi-stakeholder view. We've got to move beyond being shareholder-centric or money-centric and start to see a much broader perspective in how we value the many constituents in the life of an organisation and an organism. We need to be clear when we're defining our purpose what our uniqueness is for addressing social impact. Not just our uniqueness, but what is the uniqueness in the context of social impact? What can your organisation do that is specifically going to make a difference? Not some broad, generic, aspirational vision that doesn't actually connect, but something that really plays to your strengths and that will make a difference on the ground. To make sure that purpose lives every day in every way, that every layer of the organisation, both inside and in its connection with all of the constituencies and stakeholders, that lives and it's real. And that takes vigilance, it takes diligence, and it takes commitment and courage. That we measure and learn, that we have the agility to keep adjusting and readjusting when things haven't quite worked, and that we engage all of our constituents in that learning process. It's, we've spoken before about the need to move away from the hero leadership model, and this is so key in the new definition of business. And also that we lead from the front, that we lead with transparency, that we lead with a recognition that we have to give explanations for what we're doing, and that we actually walk the talk and actually bring it to life. And that leadership has to be consistent, courageous, and full of vision, and willing to confront some of the old ways of doing things and some of the established ways of doing things in our system, in our organisation. So hopefully you've got something to take away, something that will have prompted, maybe you disagree with everything that I've said and it's prompted some other thoughts for you. Whatever it is, the aim here is to provoke and to bring a different perspective. We'll be back in the autumn, as I said, with some new topics, and look out for those. And we will look forward to sharing those with you in due course. In the meantime, have a positive summer in whatever shape or form that may take for you, and have a good day. Bye for now.